The response by some has been, this is somehow bigoted, because if these two boxers have DSDs, differences in sexual developments, we used to call it intersex. At one point we used the word hermaphrodite. It's different from trans, where you're just a biological man who thinks he's a woman and starts acting like a woman and starts having surgeries to try to make himself resemble a woman more. This is different. But they say if they have these DSDs and they're born with female genitalia, but inside they're male, inside they have testes, and you can explain some of this because I've heard you explain it very well, then they're women. Then what's the problem? Like, if they're not faking, thinking that they're women or having been raised as girls, what's the problem?
Well, the problem is that from the perspective of sport, is that during puberty, they are going to undergo all the same development that males do as a consequence of having testes that produce testosterone that can be used by the body. And it's one of those things where sport doesn't ever really need to take on this issue of define sex and is sex binary. I think it can and it should. It shouldn't shy away from that. But it actually doesn't need to, because for the purposes of a sports conversation, really all you have to understand is that we have men's sports and we have women's sports. And the dividing line between them is that on the women's sports side, you want those humans who do not benefit from testosterone's role in the body to be able to compete against one another. And in order for that to happen, the boundary between them has to be closed and it has to be defended. So that boundary is basically, has this individual gone through life with the ability to use and benefit in the context of sport from testosterone's job? Now, everyone watching this will have heard of testosterone. It is the male hormone. It's not the only one, but it's the main one. And at puberty, not uniquely, but particularly at puberty, males are suddenly flooded with this male-making hormone. It's called an androgen. The word literally means andro, male, gen, making. And we are flooded with it. And all the changes you see in boys at puberty, the increased muscle mass, the growth in height, the change in the shape of the skeleton, the strength, the power output that they can generate, those are all attributable to the role of testosterone. And that's what female sport has to keep out. So in the case of DSDs, absolutely, you can trace back where the difference happened and how the external genitalia didn't develop in the typical male way. And as a consequence, that baby is born and the midwife or whoever it is says, well, this is a girl. That's not a biologically accurate identification, because later in life, a person will go through male puberty because they are XY with testes and testosterone. So biologically, they are the same. They're male and they experience all the same benefits from the perspective of sport that males do.
So if you have XY, do you develop any female internal organs? Do you develop breasts in puberty?
Female internal organs, no, in most cases. Now, there are some conditions where you can be XY, but then you don't have the gene that normally is found on the Y chromosome and think of it almost as the master switch that drives male development. If that gene is absent or malfunctioning, there's a condition called Swyer syndrome, for instance, where you then don't produce testes. And as a consequence, you don't have testosterone or another hormone, which is called anti-Müllerian hormone. This is getting into the biological weeds in a way. But I think from the perspective of this conversation, if you are XY and you have the signal that creates testes as opposed to ovaries, and therefore testosterone, then you also shut down the development of the female reproductive system, and that includes internal and external. In the case of DSDs, depending on which one it is, you don't develop the external genitalia. And it's interesting, if you go back to the Caster Semenya case, World Athletics argued that at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And one of the sticking points was, by all means, you can have this argument that they've got external female genitalia, but it's absolutely irrelevant to sport. What matters for the purposes of sport is whether you can use testosterone for the performance advantages it gives you later in life.
Well, how do we know which one these two boxers have?
We don't. And that's because it's their right, as it's their medical information, so they can choose to disclose it or not. If you go back to even with Caster Semenya and all the DSDs that track and field have dealt with, they very rarely do. So I don't expect that we ever will. And that's one of the realities of the situation. And it's why I think one needs to be a little bit cautious, because there are some DSDs where you don't get full male development. And in some cases, you don't get any, because you can have one of the conditions is called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So you are completely insensitive to androgens like testosterone. So you can have male testes with testosterone levels of a typical male, but you can't use it at all. And in the World Athletics case, for instance, they made a specific allowance that that condition is not part of what they regulate. So they would allow someone with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome to participate because there is no advantage, even though they are biologically male. And I think, as a broader point, this is one of the reasons why a conversation and a focus on a specific individual or case makes it more difficult, I think, to argue the principle around women's sports and how it should remain closed to male advantage, because you can very quickly spiral into these very nuanced details and find exceptions, and you start talking about edge cases and rare conditions that actually obscure the reality, which is that the IOC, as it stands, believe that female is what's written in your passport. And so the president of the IOC, Thomas Bach, can tell the world's media that he has no way of identifying who's a man and who's a woman. And it's an unsolvable problem for them, because they've chosen to value identity above biology. And all the preoccupation with one individual here and there probably allows them to do that.
Yeah, that's literally what he said. I mean, we've played the sound bites, but he said chromosomes don't determine sex. That's just not true anymore. That, you can have XY and be female, you can have, I guess, XX and be male, and that what's important here is that they listed themselves as female in their passports.
Exactly. And he knows that trans women can also be listed as female in their passport. He knows that the condition that was documented to have occurred in the athletes in track and field is 5-ARD, where you can use testosterone in the completely normal, typical way. And so there's in full male advantage. That was the conclusion from the court case around Caster Semenya. And he knows that. But and it comes back to what I mentioned to you earlier there, that in about 2020, 21, the sports landscape fragmented, and the IOC went in a direction where it chose inclusion of trans women and DSD athletes over fairness and safety for female athletes. And it was a conscious choice. I mean, you could go back to the conversations that World Rugby had. You can talk about how athletics and swimming and cycling framed it. They all realized that you cannot have all three. So if you think from the perspective of sport, is inclusion into the category of your choice. In other words, I'm male, but I identify as a woman and I want to play women's football or women's soccer for the American audience, women's basketball. Safety for the participants and fairness. And what World Rugby recognized, for instance, is that you couldn't balance those. And so you had to instead prioritize them. And the priority was safety first, fairness second, and inclusion cannot be achieved. And so therefore, trans women cannot play women's rugby. And I think the same decision was reached by swimming, it was reached by athletics, and it was reached by cycling. So the president of the IOC knows that. Those are three of the big sports at the Olympic Games. And so they've had this conversation. And when he sat and told everyone that no one has offered a solution and that they are unable to do it, it's simply dishonest.
Is it a blood test that they have the players take to figure out what the chromosomes are?
Yeah, you don't even necessarily need blood, because you can just take a scraping from the inside of the cheek and you can examine those cells, because there's a specific structure called the bar body, which only exists if you have two X chromosomes. So if you took a scrape from the inside of my cheek, you wouldn't see it, whereas the inside of yours, you would. And so if mine was absent, I would call it test negative, whereas you test positive. And so that could be used as a first screen, for instance, if they wish to go in that direction. That's what used to happen. In the 1968 Olympics, I believe it was the first time that they used that test. Prior to that, sex verification or gender testing, if you wish, used to involve having all the female participants parade in front of a panel of judges nude. And you can
Right. No one's
imagine how
talking
that
about that
was
anymore.
perceived.
Right. What about,
Exactly. That's
how do you factor in on the subject of whether the testosterone is getting used by the person with DSD or it's not getting used because there's a blocker? There's the old-fashioned process of eyes. And I mean, you look at these boxers, in particular, the one from Algeria, and this person looks like a man. They have the height advantage. They have the physicality of it. There are no breasts. And then we have the testimonial of several women who have boxed against Khalif saying it was unsafe. I did not want to box against him further, and I feel lucky to be alive, said one. Another one came out, the Italian, who said it was just too strong. This is nothing I was used to. We've seen repeatedly women say there was something different about him, and our own eyes suggest there was something different about Khalif. How does that factor in?
Yeah, I think from a policy governance perspective, you would want to be careful to make that the basis for a decision, obviously, because even though it's probably very accurate, it may be 90%, in which case 10% of the time it's not. And then you run the risk of accusing someone when they are actually not male. And so that becomes a problem for the sport. And one of the issues I think that track and field faced was the implementation of the policy around DSD athletes did over-rely on the subjective assessment. And I by no means want to diminish that, because I think in particular, and I've learned this in the last 5 or 6 years in this discussion, is that women are quite good at making that assessment because they almost have to a lot of the time. And you have to respect that. But I think there's a better way to do it where you don't ever need to even rely on subjectivity, because if you can do an initial screen that identifies an XY, or as I was saying, there's now even more sophisticated genetic tests that can identify the specific gene, that SRY, that sex determining region gene. And if you find that, then the person is male. And then you can follow that screen up with a series of diagnostic tests that are completely non-invasive and will give you an understanding of the diagnosis without ever needing to pass judgment. Because you've probably seen, the moment there's a subjective assessment, it opens up all kinds of doors for, you're going to do the nude parade and you're going to judge women based on their genitalia, which no one is proposing. Or it opens up allegations that women who don't conform to some Western gender stereotype are going to be judged and target tested.
That's what the papers are arguing right now, that's what's happening to these two boxers, that because they don't conform to a, 1950s stereotype of appearance on women, that's why we're saying that they're male. And it's been very frustrating for me because that's not it at all. Some Americans enjoy using their credit cards because it can be a hassle-free and secure way to pay. But our sponsor, the American Payments Coalition, says that some DC politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. They say the bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. They say corporate megastores will make more money and you'll end up paying the price. Find out more info at guardyourcard.com and consider telling Congress to guard your card while you're there, too. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.